Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to session 3 of Membership 101. I'm Rodney Gibbs with the RevLab, and I'm here with Yossi from LinFest and Ariel Zrolnik from Membership Puzzle Project. Glad you're here. We're halfway through the program, and so you're glad that you're sticking with it. A lot of people here today. So Ariel, do you want to give people a little warm-up exercise here?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Somebody last week pointed out that the way that the order in which you've been sharing questions and inviting feedback was making it difficult for participants because of a bit of a lag. So we figured instead we'd start the session by putting some questions up on the screen, and while we wait for everybody to join, invite you to answer one or all of these questions in the chat. I hope some of you had a chance to do some of the sort of exercises that we've been sharing as optional homework after, and if you've had a chance, would love to hear your answers to these questions, even if they're sort of a work in progress. I will say while we're doing that, please remember that if you're asking a question, you need to use the Ask a Question button in the right bottom right of the screen. That's the only way with so many questions coming in. We can sort of keep track of it to answer during the session or after the session on the discussions page. So if you have a question, use the Ask a Question feature. That'd be great. And while we wait for everybody, we have a warm up on the screen. If you could answer one of these questions, that would be great.
Maybe let's give people a heads up too to remind you this is a 90-minute class, and we have a guest at the last third of the class. Allison Go from Chalkbeat will join us.
The middle of the class.
Oh, middle of the class, pardon me.
Yeah, same as last time.
Yes. Great. So take a moment, everyone, and answer one of these questions.
The best way to sort of get some feedback and answers on some of the things you might be navigating is to share them during this class time so you and others can learn from it, and we can sort of tailor our answers a little bit more. So even if you feel a little iffy about one of these things on the screen because you haven't had a chance to fully develop it, really invite you to share that, and we can offer some advice and help workshop it a little bit. We'll give it another minute or two if we don't have any answers. We'll just move right into the lesson. You can answer them in the chat, Kim. Yes.
Yeah.
That's great, John. So you're going to find a local partner to conduct audience research with you before you launch. Sounds familiar. I'm glad that that example from Compass Experiment was helpful for you. All right, we'll give one more minute in case it was unclear where to share these. Makes sense, Omar. It's okay, but also it's really helpful to be able to iterate on it over time. So I'd encourage your team to maybe take a chance to do this before the end of the course so that you can ask some of those questions throughout.
There, we got some now.
Again, yeah, great. From Hola Carolina, make sure to put questions that are more general in the Ask a Question section so that we can keep track of them to answer on the breaks. Yeah, what do they most value? The membership offerings. Mariam, that's great. Connecting with universities to conduct the surveys. That makes a ton of sense when you're a young organization to partner with some more established institutions. That's awesome. That's a great question, Greg. First, second, or third source. I love that. That helps you understand, are you sort of the first thing they read in the morning, or maybe the thing that they read towards the end of the day when they're unwinding, I would guess. Awesome, this is great. It sounds like the audience research section was helpful for everybody. We'll get started on today's session, and some of the questions that are showing up in the Ask a Question feature, we'll get to those in the first question break that we have after the first part of today's session. Today we'll be talking about two things, same as last time, sort of breaking it up into a couple parts. We will start the session by talking about how you can develop memberful routines in your organization. And then we will have Allison Go, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for Chalkbeat. She'll be joining us to talk about how Chalkbeat feet, set goals for membership, and then I will walk you through a process that your organization could use to identify goals for your membership program. So we'll jump right in to how you can develop memberful routines in your organization. This term likely has some familiarity from the first session, in which I talked about some of the components of a member-driven newsroom. Memberful routines are quite simply the workflows that connect your audience members to journalism and the journalists producing it on a consistent basis. This is essentially what happens when engaged journalistic practice becomes part of the day-to-day sort of culture of your organization. And the reason that we focus so much on memberful routines at MPP is exactly that. If you want to build a community around your journalism, if you want to invite people into your work and make them feel a part of it, inspire them to become members, that opportunity to engage needs to be consistently available to them. And the value of doing this on a routine basis is also that when unexpected events happen, as have happened pretty much every single week of 2020, it is easier to maintain that engaged journalism if you've been able to sort of develop that as a muscle. You've put workflows in place, you know who is responsible for which part of the process, that kind of thing. And so memberful routines also play into, no, that's fine, Yossi, you can go forward. So last session, I spoke about some of the learnings that MPP gained from its research into spaces outside news and what we could take away to help media organizations be more successful at membership. Those first three on the screen, you probably remember because we spoke about them quite a bit last week in the vein of how to tell your story and how to invite people into that work. And the thing that I'll really be speaking about today is the value of offering flexible means of participation in your work. The organizations that MPP studied are attuned to people's abilities, goals, limitations, and lifestyles. And so they offer multiple paths to engage with the work. And that allows you to really maximize what you get for the members' time, effort, and sort of investment in your organization. And audience research is a really critical component to that work, understanding people's lifestyle habits and motivations for engaging with you. Next slide. So memberful routines, why should you have them? They sound like a lot of work. They are a little bit more work than a one-way journalism relationship, but they pay off in many ways. The first is that they engage your audience members more deeply, which makes them more likely to convert to members. And this is one of the reasons why memberful routines are valuable for an organization, whether you are subscription-based or membership-based. Many subscription-based organizations have done incredible work experimenting with memberful routines, and many of you that are joining here from subscription-based newsrooms have likely already done engaged journalism work within your newsrooms. The next is that they provide consistent informal feedback to your newsroom. There is, of course, the value of intentionally sitting down and conducting audience research, but when you invite people to participate into your journalism, you end up getting sort of bits and pieces of informal feedback all the time, maybe in terms of the questions they have about why you're doing it or how they participate. Maybe they give you ideas for ways that you can invite them to participate in the future. It's just a steady stream of sort of informal feedback coming in the form of their participation. And the last is that it deepens the relationship with the people who've already become your members, which makes them stickier. Thinking about it that way, audience participation is a loyalty and retention strategy. The researcher who worked on that member-driven movements report posited to MPP, it's possible that participation measured in hours rather than dollars actually more accurately correlates with how connected people feel to an organization. That is a hypothesis that we have at this point. It's not something we've necessarily been able to test super strategically, but I encourage you to understand the level of participation among your audience members as another way to assess whether they are loyal audience members. It isn't just about newsletter open rates or about how long they've been paying to support your work. You can gain a lot of insight into what they value about you from the ways and the extent to which they choose to participate. Next slide. So why do audience members participate? This is another slide that you might remember me mentioning very briefly in the first session of the course. These are the 6 motivations that Membership Puzzle Project has heard most often for why people choose to participate in the journalism and not just consume it. You see here transparency, wanting the inside scoop and understanding the process, the opportunity to contribute your expertise or learn something new. These are the motivations we heard most often. Yours might look a little bit different. That is something that you'll learn from audience research. And also, you might only see some of these amongst your audience members. This is why it's really valuable to understand who your audience is and understand which of these motivations you can activate to ask people to participate. And on the next slide, I am going to share a little bit about what it looks like when organizations take the time to understand their audience motivations and then offer opportunities to participate that reflect that. On the screen here, you see curiosity and learning. Many of you here, especially in the United States, are likely familiar with City Bureau. Their Documenters program, which invites Chicagoans to go to public meetings and document what is happening there to increase government transparency in Chicago, sort of connects to that desire to learn more and be curious about how government works. The passion sort of lever that you can pull. A great example of that is Zetland's Members Getting Members campaign, which I think I spoke about in a previous session. This is when Zetland realized that it was not going to meet its membership targets for that year with the tactics that it had in place. And so they reached out to their most loyal members, the people who had engaged the most already, and asked if they would help them recruit new members. And they gained 3,500 new members through that sort of ambassador campaign. And they achieved that by reaching out to those who already had expressed deep passion for Zetland's work and showing them how they could help ensure that Zetland was able to continue doing that work. And in the membership guide links that we'll be sharing in the post-session resources, you will find much more detail about each of these participation opportunities that you see on the screen, a little bit more about how that evolved, and some links to more information about each of these. Next slide. The other thing to think about when you're trying to offer flexible opportunities to participate, it's not just about understanding the different motivations that audience members might have. It's also understanding the different time availability that they might have. So cultivating audience participation often begins with offering sort of bite-sized opportunities to get them into the habit of engaging with your organizations as more than just consumers of your content. If you haven't yet done sort of engaged journalism work within your community, there's a bit of a learning curve to teaching them what it looks like to engage with your work. It's important to match your participation asks of your audience members with the level of relationship that they have with your organization and their disposable time. Just like you would not expect to have success asking someone who is coming to your site for the first time to become a recurring subscriber, a recurring member, you're unlikely to be able to get someone who comes to your site for the first time to commit to like moderating a panel for you for 3 hours. So it's important to sort of understand offering opportunities to participate that are commensurate with the relationship that they already have with you. This is also very important for those organizations who have equity and inclusion at the core of your work. If you say that you want to involve audience members from underserved communities, but the participation opportunities you're offering are 3, 4, 5 hour opportunities or require consistent internet access or other barriers, you're not going to actually achieve that goal of engaging those audience members, even if that was sort of an organizational mission. So it's important to understand the time constraints that many people have as you design participation opportunities, especially for that reason. And at MPP, we've started to sort of understand these stages of participation as a bit of a participation ladder. And I have on the screen an example from the citizen science movement. Some of you might be familiar with it. Citizen science is essentially this practice of inviting lay people, non-scientists, to participate in the sort of scientific process alongside researchers. This is incredibly impactful. It's very common in terms of environmental impact science work, climate change work, et cetera. And what I love about this example is it shows how the people who have organized these citizen science projects understand the different levels of ability to contribute, to participate, and have identified 4 ways that you can engage, and you can choose which one is commensurate with your experience and time. So at the lowest level there, level 1, you see citizens as sensors. And what they mean by that is the process of equipping lay people to learn how to take measurements and then be fed into the database for the project. Here in South Florida, where I am right now, this is very common around climate change tracking. There are a number of projects in Miami that have trained local residents to measure water levels at key moments of the year in order to track the impact that climate change is having on levels. And that's a fairly simple process. You probably go out and take the measurement for 5 minutes a few times a year and then email that information. And so it's a fairly low ask. And then you move up into these sort of higher asks that require a higher level of knowledge, higher level of engagement. And this is a really important thing to understand, is the sort of 15-minute ask, the 1-hour ask, and the 3-hour ask. And so at MPP, if you're trying to figure this out, what we encourage people to do is sit down with the participation that they are hoping to cultivate amongst their audience members, and you can write it out on a ladder if you want, just like you see on the screen. What is the 15-minute opportunity to participate that you're offering them? What is the 1 hour opportunity to participate that you're offering them? And what is like the extensive 3 hour opportunity to participate that you're offering them? And you'll begin to get a feeling for who wants to participate at which level. You might start to build a bit of an audience segment that is highly engaged, had been members for a year, in which you might send them the 3 hour ask, but you're putting in your main newsletter the sort of 15-minute ask that you hope many of your audience members will choose to sort of activate or take advantage of. Next slide. So the sort of steps to identifying these participation opportunities are pretty straightforward, I hope. The first is that you're going to find that intersection point of your audience member motivations and your newsroom needs. So we already talked about the audience member motivations and how you're going to find that out. That is going to be revealed to you through audience research, through surveys, maybe just through informal feedback with your members. And then your newsroom needs are pretty straightforward. The needs at one point in time might be greater financial sustainability. Maybe you need to reach a financial target. Maybe you want to dig into an incredibly complex topic and your reporter needs to spend some time with an expert on that topic. And so what you really need is for the audience members to contribute their expertise. Maybe you are trying to build a database or investigate whether something is happening in your community, but you don't have the data in order to answer your questions. And so maybe the thing that you need your audience members to contribute is their electricity bills for the last year, because you're investigating whether the prices are being inflated. One of the organizations that we've studied at MPP is Corrective in Germany, and they were trying to do an investigation into property, housing ownership, and prices in Hamburg, Germany. But in Germany, all of that information is private record. And so what Corrective Newsroom did is created a form in which residents of Hamburg could submit their leases and submit information like their rent. And they, through those audience member submissions, they were able to build out a database that allowed them to answer these questions about property ownership in Hamburg in a way that they wouldn't have been able to if they'd only relied on their access to government documents. So that intersection point is the first thing, and that's often the most challenging part of the process. But once you get it right, it becomes a muscle that you can make these decisions much more easily. The next thing is to think about the stage of the reporting process in which it's going to happen. This is likely pretty easy for your organization to identify. And the reason that this is helpful is this is when you begin to develop the workflows and you think about who needs to be involved in this participation opportunity in order for it to be successful, who needs to be in the meetings to plan it, how often is it going to happen? And the other thing to think about is if your organization is trying to transition to that true sort of co-creation that we say we all are aiming for when we begin these engaged journalism projects, it's also really helpful to look at what stage of the journalistic process those opportunities that you're offering on a regular basis are happening. If all of those participation opportunities are happening in the post-publication stage, then you're not actually giving audience members the opportunity to influence your work. You're just asking them to help you distribute it. And that is very valuable in its own right. But if you're trying to allow audience member contributions to truly influence some of the journalism that you're doing to help direct your sort of editorial agenda in ways that you are comfortable with, it's really important to think about involving them at the planning stages through audience listening, at the research and reporting stage by inviting them to offer reporting tips or contribute sources to the work, at the editing and fact-checking stage, maybe inviting them to proofread a draft that is highly technical if you have an expert in that area amongst your audience members. Next slide. So one really strong example of this that I hope will sort of help bring this into relief comes from Radio Ambulante's listening clubs. Radio Ambulante is a narrative storytelling podcast that publishes in Spanish around the world. And back in 2018, they realized that this sort of really vibrant community had sort of developed organically around the podcast. But their growth editor, Jorge, who was sort of managing that community and making sure that people were always responded to and whatnot, the community was growing too much for him to manage on his own. But they couldn't necessarily reallocate their resources in order to provide him more staff to support him in that work. And so they came up with their listening clubs. The listener motivation that they were trying to solve for is the fact that listeners wanted more people to talk about Radio Ambulante with. And that is because it is this very sort of like the Radio Ambulante podcast is really deep into people's emotions and lived experiences. And so it generated a lot of conversation, and people often had a lot of sort of observations that built up through listening to the podcast. And they wanted somebody to talk to about it after. They were bringing those to the Facebook group. And then the Radio Ambulante staff was sort of having to manage that. And so they were like, how can we give listeners an outlet to engage in the podcast that doesn't require us to continue functioning as the middleman? And their need there was, again, to scale the community building work, to allow the community building work to grow beyond the capacity for one person to manage it. So they created these listening clubs. Essentially, they hosted 20 pilot listening clubs in various cities around the world where their staff lived. And they invited people to come together to listen to the podcast live and then join for a discussion after that. The reporting process stage that happened in this case was in the distribution stage. But I bring this up because I think it's a really clear example of finding that intersection point between audience members' motivations to become even more loyal and even more engaged, Radio Ambulante's need. And this ties very closely into sustainability because they were doing this the year before they planned to launch their membership program. And so this cultivated a much more far-reaching and more loyal audience ahead of the moment they were going to ask people to financially support their work. Next slide. And so, great. Next slide, Yossi. Sorry, something's a little bit mixed up. We jumped too far. Make participation a routine. One more back. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. So the last element of that is once you've identified the participation opportunity, the next step is figuring out how to make that a routine in your organization, how to make that a muscle so that it can continue to happen even as things are getting a bit hectic. Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of an MVP, aka pilot. And so the important thing is to think about participation opportunities as MVPs as well. Just like when you're launching a new newsletter, you're sort of going through the process of coming up with an initial idea, trying it, evaluating it, and iterating on it and trying it again until you get to the point where it's hitting the goals that you want it to be hitting. Participation opportunities work the same way. And so I encourage you, if you identify a participation opportunity for your organization, understand that it's not something that you try once and then do it the same thing, the same way over and over again. You're going to want to go through this sort of iterative process of designing the MVP, trying it out, evaluating it through a retrospective, and then iterating on that participation opportunity based on the feedback from them, and repeating that until you feel good about where it lands. In the post-session resources, we'll share some of the parts of the membership guide in which we provide additional advice on how to design an MVP that was written by Yossi. And so you can begin to break down what it might look like for your newsroom to try that with one of your engaged journalism projects. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, great. So sorry to go back, Yossi. The one thing I just wanted to bring up is the example of how Radio Ambulante did their own sort of MVP process. So the first 20 listening clubs that they hosted with staff members present allowed them to work out a lot of the kinks about the process and figure out how to set them up for success. So they learned things like you need to offer something like coloring pages to allow people to focus on the podcast, because many people are used to sort of driving or cleaning or doing other things while they listen to the podcast, which actually allows them to focus their minds on what they're listening to. They realize they need to give some people something to do with their hands. Their minds didn't wander. And they learned about how much time they should advise people to rent a venue for if they were going to host these conversations. And so then what they did is they turned all of that into a guide on how to host your own listening club and distributed that amongst their listeners and offered training and discussions and advice on how to host your own listening club, and then invited audience members to begin doing that. And last time we spoke to their growth editor, Jorge Caraballo, I believe they said they had 120 listening clubs happening around the world on a regular basis. And so that was really critical for expanding the feeling of community without the Radio Ambulante staff members having to be the ones providing that community every single week as a new podcast episode dropped. So you see there the intersection point, and then the way that they turned that into routine. They tested the pilot, they made it a routine, and then they made it possible for all of their audience members to do that work for them over and over again. And thank you, Chris, for your question, because it actually leads directly into this moment. I wanted to see if there is anybody here who has offered participation opportunities up to their audience members before, or has an idea for a way that they could offer a participation opportunity to their members. How does it help the organization, and how does it help the person that's participating? I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that have come in while you all are dropping this in the chat. No problem, Maria. Thank you for dropping it.
There's a few questions in there. Some are upvoted.
Yeah. Yep. Right. We'll give people a minute to answer this, and I will start to answer some questions while we wait. How best to combine a subscription and membership model? I think we spoke about this quite extensively in the last 2 weeks, so I don't know if I have too much more to add here. We spoke about blended models in session 1. I think the important thing to decide is what part of your work is about monetizing access to content, and what part of your work is about monetizing the relationship or community that develops around it. So that could look 2 ways. One example is from The Guardian, who has a sort of overarching membership model in that they invite people to contribute to encourage the work to continue to exist and develop that sort of community around it. And then they have subscriptions to an app, for example. So there you see primary membership model and then a subscription model for one particular product that they offer. The flip side of that, a lot of legacy metro organizations have chosen this approach. They are primarily a subscription model in that they have a paywall at some level, and people have to pay to access more than a couple stories a month. But once someone is a subscriber, they then offer them many deeper engagement opportunities. There's sort of like a membership program sitting at the other side of the subscription for people once they pay to become a subscriber. So those are 2 examples that we see out there. But again, the sort of central question to ask is, what is more important to us? What are we going to prioritize? Is it monetizing the relationship around our work, in which case you're primarily going to choose a membership model? Or do you see the best path forward for your organization around monetizing access to the content? That also gets into questions of sort of education equity. You'll see your screen. Education equity, information equity, you might want to make sure that the majority of your journalism remains available for people to access. And so a membership model might be better for you because you don't want to have to wall off access to content. Miriam, this is a great question. Is there a correlation between the most common participation reasons and disposable income? Are people generally curious enough to want to pay to know more? I'm assuming the younger the member, the less likely they're willing to pay or give time. I don't know if that's true about the age factor. At least here in the United States, we have seen the fact that like my generation and the generation behind me grew up being used to paying for things like Spotify and music through iTunes and Hulu subscriptions and Netflix subscriptions and things like that that are beginning to change the understanding of being able to access things for free. There is certainly a correlation between people's disposable time and their willingness to participate. And that is one of the reasons why I brought up the importance of offering flexible means of participation. If you are truly trying to be inclusive in your approach to participation, you need to be factoring in the fact that some people might not be, they might work nights instead of daytime. And so if you're inviting them to events, how are you going to solve for that? You might want to think about how much time you're asking them to give on any given week, or whether they're having to travel significant geographic distance in order to engage. So that's when it becomes really important to know your audience members and sort of understand their own ability to support. Next question from John is simply asking for contributing content a viable point of participation. We have seen this work for many organizations. You're not asking them to contribute content. And I think what's important is to understand what you're asking. You're asking them to deepen the impact and scope of your journalism. In the case of the sort of censors, you're asking them to increase the impact of the science that they're engaging in. So you're not just asking them, I mean, there's like a whole lot of work around UGC, user-generated content, asking people to tag you in photos or share your story or things like that. And that is a viable distribution method, but that is not co-creation. That's not engaged journalism. That's a bit of a different consideration here. But when you're asking people to be new censors, as you put it, you're inviting them into the work in a very meaningful way in which they can shape the coverage. And that's the sort of difference about what we're talking about here. We'll take one more question here regarding surveying our audience. We think the best approach is to hire a professional survey firm. I answered this in the questions last week. I will repeat the answer here. I will encourage people to go after the class and look back into this questions and answers slide where you are dropping your questions, because I have gone in and answered those questions after the fact in writing. The pros and cons of a professional survey firm, of course, if your team is really resource and time strapped, then maybe a professional survey firm is valuable. But I do think it is a very good practice for your audience to, for your team to become familiar with your audience members as more than sources. I know Joelle and Eason is on the call, and one of the things that I loved her speaking about in a conference last year is that at the sort of height of COVID, they had every reporter in the newsroom, and Joelle, and correct me if I'm misremembering, but all the reporters on your staff were asked to conduct one or two sort of brief, like 30-minute interviews with new subscribers to the Bangor Daily News. And that's a really smart way to get your audience members, get your team members into the habit of listening to your audience members. It is very good for them to know your audience members in a sort of deeper, more holistic way. And I would encourage you to at least start by having your team do this work so that they understand the value of the insights that you gain from that. And then maybe down the line, if you need to do it in much greater scope, yes, then you could hire a professional survey firm. But there's something very valuable about your audience members doing your team members doing some of this work as well. And Joelle, and feel free to correct me in the chat if there's anything about that I misremembered, but I thought it was a fantastic example of ways that you can invite your team into the audience research process. Do we have Allison here yet, Rodney, or should I continue answering a couple of questions?
She is here. You ready for her to come up?
Yeah, I think so. And we'll have a break for questions again after Allison's presentation, and I'll get to some of these. I'll also answer some of them in writing if they're more simple questions.
I just saw her a second ago. Pardon me. There she is. I see her.
And I'll do a brief introduction while we're working on getting her up onto screen. So Allison Go is the Chief Strategy Officer for Chalkbeat, and I asked her to join us today because when we were working on the membership guide, one of the things that we realized we needed to teach people how to do is how to set goals for their membership program. It's really important to know why you're doing it before you actually undertake the work. And in our conversations with Chalkbeat, Allison laid out for us this very sort of like strategic and measured process for setting this up that I thought was an excellent example of how to go into your membership effort with clear understanding of what it looks like for membership to work for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Allison now. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, awesome. All right, let's open the next slide. Okay, so let's start. What is Chalkbeat? And thank you for, I don't know, person called the Revenue Lab for posting the link to Chalkbeat. So Chalkbeat is a nonprofit local newsroom covering public education in 8 states. This is our tagline, essential education reporting across America. We are a fairly large organization at this point, roughly anywhere between 1 to 5 reporters in whatever kind of city or state that we're in. 60 employees total, and then 40-ish on the newsroom side, with a $12 million budget year over year. So fairly large organization. We are primarily philanthropy funded, but part of our, it's like mostly philanthropy, like let's say 85%, and then some portion sponsorship, and then a smaller portion is this membership / small donor revenue stream. So not a primary revenue stream for us, and I'm happy to answer questions about why, but it is significant enough that it is part of our investment, and also as we grow and hopefully enter more cities, it will become more and more important. Okay, so our overall goals, like as an organization, agnostic of the membership program, is to provide deep local coverage of education, policy, and practice. That's kind of a summary of our mission statement. And the way we do it is kind of 3 kind of obvious statements, but like I think it's actually important to say it out loud. So one is report and analyze the news. And I think every news organization says they do this. Hopefully they do it. The second part I think is actually unique to not just Chalkbeat, but I think it is like a relatively new thing. And I'm not totally convinced like your legacy papers or many of your larger news organizations do this and put it as part of their mission statement. But this is to build engaged communities. So part of our hypothesis and thesis is that you don't just report and analyze the news and put it out into the world, but you need to be having conversations with people all the time, with your own community members, especially if you're going to be providing coverage around equity and that's supposed to speak to underrepresented groups. You can't just like speak out into the void and then hope they hear you. You need to really be part of the conversation. And those conversations are good in and of itself, but they also then have like a feedback loop, flywheel, sorry for the jargon, that actually helps you report and analyze the news better. This is a really important feedback loop there. And then the third is, of course, make it sustainable all along the way, in my opinion, by any means necessary. Next slide. Okay, so then let's talk about specifically our membership program. And because that setup is important, because I think something really ingrained in what we do even before our membership program was this engaged journalism. And I know that for a lot of, if you're just starting a membership program or you're coming from a much more legacy kind of way of thinking about this, like the membership program is the entry point into a more engaged kind of audience development strategy. But for us, it was like already being done. And then membership is like another layer on top of that. And so you'll see how that plays out in kind of the slides coming up. But okay, so one is we already had a small donor practice. So we already had like a thing on our site that said donate, and you can donate both recurring and non-recurring. So that membership wasn't a distinction around like recurring and not recurring for us. But it wasn't branded. It was just like someone at some point in the past was like, you know, we're just leaving money on the table by not having a donate button, so just put it up there. And we did have end of year campaigns and spring campaigns like a nonprofit would, but there wasn't any incentives behind it. It was just like an ask via email, and there was no like kind of yearly programming around this small donor thing. It was just like, we should ask. If you don't ask, you're an idiot for not asking. But like no real like kind of holistic thought around like what the ask means and what it means to be a donor for Chalkbeat. Next slide. So the way I thought about goal setting here and like what are we actually doing? So I think the way we thought about this was like the macro problem we were kind of contemplating. Like one was just like, is membership, and you may all be in like a version of this. It's like, is membership a revenue thing, or is it a newsroom thing? Is it a engagement thing? So that's like an overarching question. And a way to help frame that larger question was like, okay, what are our hypotheses, multiple kind of possibly contradicting hypotheses around why anyone would do membership, and then try to like really outline what it would look like. And by outlining these hypotheses, we could then launch a program and use the data, like the feedback loop, to understand like where this should live kind of existentially. So we actually started with a much bigger problem, which is like, what is this thing? Like, are we like at NPR, then the membership program is like really strictly a revenue thing. But in some other places we've seen like some really like amazing, I think like Devil Strip does this really well. It's like part of like how they talk to people in their community, and membership is like a overarching language they use around that. So like two extremes in my opinion. And we were like, where do we sit in these extremes, and how do we even answer this question? So that's where this like hypotheses came up. And then this kind of step-by-step way of validating these hypotheses. Next slide. Okay, so the hypothesis we came up with were one, and I'm kind of using language that comes from e-commerce, to be perfectly honest. My background is kind of weird. I started in journalism. I was like the editor of my college paper. I went to Michigan. And then I was at the Boston Globe, and I was at the US News and World Report. And then I was like, oh my God, this industry is like collapsing. I'm going to go to business school, either to save journalism or just like escape journalism, one or the other. So I did both, which is I went into the tech industry for a while, worked at like some of the big tech companies, worked at a couple e-commerce places, and then came back to journalism to work in the nonprofit sector, because I think it's really the most viable way for important journalism to come into existence. So like ends up being both escaping and then coming back to try to do something about it. But so you're going to see a lot of like language that's not typically used, I would say, in the news industry, but like trying to bring like a a business like sensibility to the problem. So the first way I thought about it was acquisition, what I was calling acquisition, which is like bringing money in the door. The second part is retention. And then there's two parts of acquisition, which I'll break down in a second. Then there's retention, which is like getting people to stay or people who already donated to donate more and over again. The fourth row here is called knowledge community. So this goes back to the question of like, is membership a revenue generating activity, or is it a impact generating activity, or is it some sort of both? And so we wanted to kind of articulate what it would mean, how we would know it was really good for a knowledge community or not. And then like the last question is like, is it even worth it to invest in this and put like dedicated time on it? Like, should we hire somebody full time or half time to really focus on this and drive outcomes, right? So those were the 4 things. Acquisition part 2, I'm cheating here. I'm like rewriting history because I really didn't actually anticipate part 2, but I'm adding it now. But like, I think there are 2 parts of this acquisition. It's like how many small donors can we have? But like what turns out to be true, spoiler alert, is like there is a lot of halo effects around a membership program, which is that it also allows you to bring in more dollars in other forms and engage in conversations from your other revenue sources. So like yes, it brings in more small donors, but it also brings in more major donor and foundation dollars now it's a hypothesis, but it's actually like I backed into this. Okay, so that's the hypothesis part. Next slide. And then, oh, I think I screwed something up here in the header. So what the next part is, okay, so if my hypothesis is that having a membership program will help me help us convert more people at a higher rate. What it would actually look like if we succeeded. So in column 2, it shouldn't say metric, it should say what success looks like. Anyways, so and then it was like, okay, what is the metric of success that like represents it? What's like the proxy for the sentence, right? So there's like what it feels and what will feel and look like, and then there's like the measurable thing that we should be tracking to see if it worked. So deciding if I should go through each one, but I'll kind of pick and choose a couple examples here. So the first one is like acquisition is like, does the act of saying membership, like, hey, we have this program, it's a holistic thing, here are some incentives, does it actually convert better on a per email or a per newsletter subscriber basis than if I didn't say that and if I was just using a pure like end of year campaign kind of language? And are the dollar amounts higher than if I weren't using that language? So that's one. Does it mobilize other dollars meaning like major donor foundation? Retention is, do people cancel less or donate more or donate again at a higher rate? Really the same metric kind of flipped. Knowledge community would be like, do we notice, can we track in any way, even if it's like kind of like manually track that like, okay, we had an event for members and then that created some sort of interaction with our editorial team, which then created a story, which then had an impact. It's a little bit indirect, but like, this is actually how engagement journalism works. So like just having this like membership program create more of those opportunities. And then the last one is like, just like add up the costs and add up how much money you made. And like, is there a ROI? Does the money you made offset the cost? More, and it can't just offset it should be more than, right? Okay, so we set that up and like we actually did like kind of have these hypotheses. Like I didn't actually back into all the hypotheses, just the one. So we launched this thing trying to be like, okay, well, how are we going to like, is this going to work? So what we did. So one, we launched a true membership program in November of 2018. So the results you'll see in a second are 2018 results as well as 2019. And then we obviously don't have 2020 yet. And we are comparing to like the 2017 numbers. Things that were new were that we had the thing called membership now. We actively used it to incentivize major donors and foundations to match. And many of you guys probably know about Newsmatch, maybe not, but basically gonna give credit to the wrong people, but I believe the Knight Foundation gives money so that, if you hit a certain number, then they will match that. And so what you can do is get more people to match on top of that, right? So you can have a 5X match or a 4X match. And so it's an opportunity to re-engage the people who are already donating at larger numbers to add to pitch in a 5X and say, hey, if you give us another 5X, it will make our small donor campaigns go better. So it's just like this, like, once again, like, it's all about the feedback loops. That's how you make more money, right? This is the first time we included incentives in a tiered system. So you can see them on the right here. The lowest incentive is just like a member newsletter that we kind of blast out to everyone. And then there's, this year we have socks. This is a recent screenshot, but the first year we had a water bottle, and the second year we had an umbrella. Yeah. And then the highest level is like a exclusive State of Chalk Beat type event with our CEO. So this is completely new, the idea of benefits. And then just like for background information, the campaign itself lasted 2 months. We start at the beginning of November and it ends December 31st. But the quote unquote data collection period is partially just that time, but like to do the recurring and the retention metrics, you actually technically need a year to know if you are retaining people better, right? So technically a year, but most of the information you kind of know pretty early on, whether it's working or not. Okay, so what happened? Okay, I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. I'm not gonna say them all out loud, but basically like it sort of worked. And some of it really worked, and some of it like didn't really matter. Nothing went down, right? So here's what we learned for us, and these are not universal results. So I'm just showing you because it's interesting to see like a real life example. But for us, yes, acquisition went up. The numbers look like they go up a lot, but in reality, our newsletter to donation percentage didn't go up that much. The raw number went up because our newsletters went up, right? So like that core number actually went up, and so that's very successful. But our ability to convert people, I think it went from like 2 to 2.1, which is like not really that great. The number, the donation amount went up, but that's because we set the defaults on the like donation like form higher. We just like went for it, and it didn't seem to decrease our conversion rate, but we did increase the amount on average people gave. So that's kind of cool, especially the recurring one. Like, if someone's going to do a recurring monthly, they're just going to go for it, it turns out. So we set the default from 12 to 15, and just that average went up by $3. Go figure. The major donor, super interesting, right? So this number also went up by quite a bit, but I think the most interesting part of this is that we actually make more from the major donor match than from the actual campaign itself. So it just shows you how important this feedback loop is between the two, and like why this is now part of like how we do goal setting every year is like the major donor feedback loop around the end of the year campaigns and the membership campaigns. Retention, the cancellation rate turns out is like super low to begin with. So like you can't even improve on it. It was so nominal. Like one person or two people cancel a year. It's like just nothing. So you can't even really get better. And the repeat donor rate, it's a TBD because I just couldn't find the numbers, to be perfectly honest. But what I do know is that we're way below our peers on this. And so what we know is that launching membership in and of itself isn't enough. We need to do way more to catch up with our peers. We're likely going to do stuff like direct mail, more like hand letters, whatnot, a little bit more personalization, and see what we can do about this repeat donor rate. We also don't do special messaging for past donors. And so we might need to be more aggressive on this front, but just switching to membership doesn't seem to do much, or didn't get as much closer to where we are. And we're kind of off the benchmarks, in my opinion. Knowledge community, I think the background here, we're already super engaged with our readership. And so we just did not see any extra engagement through membership. Now, another organization that doesn't do any engagement may see a really big bump here, to be honest. But I think since we have our baseline was really high to begin with, there was just nothing noticeable that more interaction. Like we ask our readers for like tips and feedback already like once every 2 months across all our different bureaus. Like another email from our membership team is like just not going to do anything, right? But if you went from 0 to 2 a year, that could be a big effect. And then last, from a cost of like an ROI point of view, you can see if we're making roughly 42 or 50 from this program, just from the small donor, not from the major donor part. This is roughly like half a person's salary and all-in cost plus like the swag. And so like it pays for itself. It's not a wild success, but if you notice, we're like super low on a lot of benchmarks. So to me, this is an easy justification because of keeping a person around really focused on this, because it's only upside. Like 2% is like average, if not like below average. So if we got up to like 3%, which is like 3% conversion rate, that's just upside for us, right? So someone working on that consistently, working on that problem, figuring it out, is only going to be like additional revenue. So to me, it really justified the existence of a person focused on this. Also, this number just naturally grows anytime we add additional locations. So because that just increases our audience naturally. So once again, like adding new bureaus doesn't add any extra work for one person because it's like a centralized, we send the same emails to you no matter where you live. And so it doesn't increase the number of emails and like complexity, it just increases your audience size. So we just know this is gonna keep growing. So it's like an investment we're definitely gonna continue to make. Next slide. Okay, so here's what we learned, conclusions we came to. For Chalkbeat, this is revenue driving activity, and it really has very little interaction with our newsroom team. And so in the future, this person was actually just like literally in an interstitial space from an org structure point of view. And over time, we're going to move the membership person fully into revenue. It's not happened yet, but like we're all in agreement that makes sense. That they should be like mentally close to like how the major donor people are thinking. So it just like makes sense to slot them there. Very powerful storytelling tool for major donors. I already said this, that we earn more from major donors than members during the end of year campaign. Pays for itself, scales linearly. And that we at Chalkbeat are quite, in our opinion, behind to our peers, like our very impressive peers, and literally like, how do they do it? And so we have much room for improvement, which further justifies kind of a concentrated effort around this. I mean, Chalkbeat is at a certain size where we can do this. I don't think that makes that much sense when you're really small, like a 10-person, 15-person outlet. But at 60, and with these numbers, like even though they're lower than philanthropy, they're still big enough and worthwhile to put a dedicated person here. And then what I was saying before about our newsroom engagement team is like, they're already so strong that like, we really are not seeing any lift on the newsroom side. So like, let's just focus on making this like a revenue machine, and look forward from there. Okay, it's the end of my
Thanks, Allison. If people have questions for Allison specifically, drop them in the Ask a Question section. We're perfectly on time. Well done. There are a couple of things about Allison's presentation that I want to sort of emphasize now that she's finished. The first is how clearly she articulated what were the memberful routines at Chalkbeat and what was the membership program. And so their decision to not make their engagement work part of the membership program because their commitment to equity. I taught another class today, so maybe I'm conflating the two, but I think somebody asked a question about this earlier about, do we make the engagement a benefit of our membership program when we have a commitment to equity? And Chalkbeat's decision was no, because we want everybody to benefit from that. And this example she gave is such a perfect example of why at MPP we started differentiating between a membership program and our memberful routine. Your membership program is usually going to be a revenue generating mechanism for your organization. And memberful routines are the practices that bring your audience members and your journalists closer. And so to Joellen's question about how do you blend a subscription and membership, this is one way that you do that. You offer memberful routines in your work and you begin to build that sort of engaged journalism practice. You can do that without having a membership program. So I just want to draw their attention to that and how strategically they sort of decided that that was where the engaged journalism work was going to live. But that ties into their value proposition. And so that is one of the reasons why we had everybody do a value proposition work early in this, is Chalkbeat's value proposition has equity right at the center of it. And so it helped Allison as they were making these decisions. And, you know, correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but like, because equity was part of your value proposition, it made it very easy for you to understand that that engagement work needed to exist outside of being connected to those who are financially connected to the organization. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight is her talking about how membership sort of leads to other forms of funding. This is something we've seen at MPP very often, is funders are often asking for metrics to show your impact. And those organizations with membership have often found that their member numbers, particularly growth in member numbers, becomes a really valuable signal to funders that they are growing their impact and reach in the community. And that becomes a way that you can argue for the fact that you are worth investing in. So those are two things that Allison spoke about that I think are really valuable for everybody on this call, whether you are a small organization launching with a fixed membership model, or you're a subscription-based organization just trying to figure out some of this sort of engaged journalism work. These are maybe helps you clarify how you might make the decisions for your own organization. Let's see, we have a question from Michael Karam that says, Allison, who on the team at Chalkbeat was engaged in this whole process, setting the hypothesis, measuring the metrics, and reflecting on it all?
Great question. So it was primarily me. So at the time I was the head of growth, and like with that, how we defined that at the time was like, I'm the head of all the speculative, ambiguous projects. It's kind of like was the kind of the organizing principle there at the time. And then the people who were super involved were like me, the head of revenue, and then our head of our COO. And that was kind of a weird one because it was mostly because she previously was kind of in charge of this. So she was just like the one who knew all the things from before. And so this was like a formalization of this thing that kind of had been done in an ad hoc way previously. We involved the larger team kind of in an updating point of view. So like before we launched the campaign, definitely like shared out what we were doing to the whole staff. They were like, people were not in the weeds. And then we did a kind of an update at the end to the whole staff. But like, for instance, the people who were not particularly involved were our CEO, founder, was just like, do it, go do it, do make it work. And the EIC was not as involved. She would, I ran some of the messaging by her to make sure it didn't conflict with our own tone and, conflict with what we're doing as a newsroom, but she wasn't like in the weeds at all.
Thanks. And it looks like you've answered the branded socks question already in the chat.
I'm excited personally for my socks. So,
a question from Marianne, I think is maybe a bit of a question for both of us is, just wanted some further clarification. Is it better to ask a potential member for a donation instead of offering a direct membership? I'll answer this more generally, and then Allison, if you want to add anything specific to Chalkbeat. So most organizations are try to turn donors into recurring supporters, aka members, because it is a more reliable revenue stream, and you can begin to deepen that relationship. As I understood, this is one of the hypotheses that Chalkbeat was testing, is whether their revenue from small dollar support would go up if they transitioned that to membership from donation. That is something that is generally in the retention section of the membership guide. We have a lot more about that, but you're just more likely to retain people if you can get them on a recurring support basis as a member. Of course, some people might not be ready to make that commitment the first time you ask for their support. So we at MPP and News Revenue Hub as well encourage people to have an option to give a one-time donation instead. But your default should be to get people to become a recurring supporter and make that the thing that is the easiest for people to opt into, and then offer donation if that feels like a step too far for them first. Does that follow your sort of journey at Chalkbeat as well, Allison?
Yeah, I think the way I think about it is we always would prefer, I mean, another metric we tracked was like percent that was recurring versus percent that donated as a one-time. And you always, like in any business, you prefer recurring, just like for just so many reasons. There are many reasons why someone might not donate the next year, and you're just like kind of removing this like friction there. The thing I think I realized, so it's interesting, is we Chalkbeat recently acquired the Philadelphia Public School Notebook, which is like we turned it into Chalkbeat Philadelphia, and they have an amazing membership / small donor. Like their metrics are like, they make more in Philly than we do. Like the other 6 slightly behind are like total. Like it's kind of embarrassing, honestly. And but the thing they're amazing at is the repeat donor, one-time donor kind of activity. And you know what it is? It's like, yes, there's these mechanical things, but they really just invested in like a lot of engagement with their donor class, right? And like literally handwritten notes. Like I was like, I can't write handwritten notes to people in Colorado. Like I just like can't. Like I don't know anything about Colorado, like just geographically, right? It's just like it's not as realistic for us to do some of this stuff. So we just have to make a choice. Like we could squeeze out a couple more dollars by doing some of this, but like I'm thinking about Chalkbeat kind of in the aggregate. So like, I guess my short answer is like yes, always get recurring if you can, but much of the repeat comes from hard work, like down the line, like repeating things, like pinging people, reminding them of your value prop, and like trying to form what at least looks like a personal relationship. And then there is a point where you just may have to decide that you can't do it. Like we, as a centralized, decentralized organization, it's like very difficult. But some of the smaller, like, you know, like the name of the city is in their like organization, and then they're truly like extremely rooted and not topically focused. Like for us, it's just hard because we just naturally have a smaller audience, because like, yes, we're in Colorado, or like we're in, let's say Denver and like the surrounding suburbs. Like the only people who read us are people who are interested in education. So it's like the funnel gets smaller and smaller. So like our numbers are just never going to be as big as like a general interest regional entity, right? And so it's harder for us to drive some of that engagement from a donor point of view. And that's just a choice we're making. We're just saying, I don't think we can invest in that. And I think that like that might be fine for us, but it might be the wrong call for another organization. I don't know if that answered your question, but like, yeah, my takeaway is like, some of this recurring stuff takes a lot of time, and the shortcut is the recurring donation button, but there's like other ways to do this, and they just require more legwork, and it doesn't seem like there's a way around it. An interesting stat I heard from in my research around the membership stuff was like the consideration period for someone to donate to NPR is 7 years. So it's like, I don't know how they did this research, but like they basically said like people were thinking about donating to NPR for 7 years before they did it. So I don't feel that bad.
I think that time lapse is really interesting. In the before you joined in the first half of this, we talked about the value of memberful routines. And one of the things that we've found at MPP through audience research is if somebody has engaged in some way more deeply, you can significantly shrink that time period before they decide to support your organization financially, because they feel a deeper connection much more quickly. So when you have this sort of like one-way model of like the public radio membership drive, you might need that 7 years. But if you have a more engaged model, you might find that time frame shortened quite a bit, because you begin to develop a deeper relationship with at least a small subset of your population.
I'm thinking about NPR, and I think, you know, they don't have your email. You know, they're not newsletter driven as so like this is why newsletters become very important here, because they're just telling you, and you're in your car and you're like, when are you going to donate? So I think there's like, it's harder for radio, but they've also been around a lot longer. Like Chalkbeat hasn't even been around for 7 years. Like, so like, but I do think, I think there's some mechanistic things that are happening here that why it's so long, but you know, NPR is doing fine.
And if there's anybody who's in the class that is coming from a public radio station that wants to in the chat add any additional insights there, that'd be great. I think we're gonna move on to helping you do what Allison did. Michael said something like, I love how she's formalized this thinking into a matrix. We're gonna help you do that. This is going to maybe seem a little bit daunting in a sort of verbal format, because it's kind of a lot of strategic thinking. But what I encourage you to do is sort of absorb it, ask me questions if you don't understand something about how the process actually works, and then sit down after the class and think about what this would like. Don't stress out too much during the class about your ability to like write your sort of objective immediately. And I also wanted to make one ask, participating George mentioned that his organization had invited audience members to engage in a big journal investigative project. I would love to hear more about that. So George, if while we're going through the session, if you wanted to maybe say a little bit more about this investigative project and how you involved them and how you did so while protecting the integrity of this investigative work that you were doing, I think that'd be really helpful for the class. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I wanted to hear more about that. I think it'll be helpful for other folks. So as Allison just walked us through, she walked us through the goal setting process that Chalkbeat went through and before they launched their membership program. And so we're going to talk about how you set your own membership goals. And there are many ways that you could do this. So like everything else we've had up to this point in the course, we are giving you a suggested framework if you don't have a preferred way of doing things. But if your organization has done a strategic plan before, you have a goal setting process that you're really happy with, that is fine. This is not necessarily a superior process, but we've tried to put together something that is very easy, particularly for sort of tiny resource strapped teams to go through this process. So broadly speaking, success in a member-driven newsroom is going to look like creating value for your audience members so they engage with you and become members, and then creating value for your existing members so that they stick around and engage more deeply. So there's a growth element to this, and there's a retention element to this. And the most common framework that you likely hear around goals is the SMARTY framework. We will drop in the slides that you'll receive after. You'll, as always, find links in the slides, and so we'll be linking to a deeper explanation of SMARTY goals. But basically, this lays out the things that a goal needs to be for it to be actionable and useful for your organization. It needs to be connected to your organizational mission. This is why we've had all of you do a value proposition statement quite early on in this course. It needs to be measurable. So you're going to want to figure out what metrics are going to indicate to you when you're reaching that. We saw that very clearly with the matrix that Allison put up. It's going to be ambitious in that if you met this goal, it would mean meaningful progress for your organization. You don't want to set like super low goals that you blow out of the water in the first week. The other thing that many organizations do is implement an initial goal and then a stretch goal, so that if you get to that earlier than expected, you might set a new goal for the organization. But you also want to make sure that it's realistic. There's a real chance of succeeding. A lot of us are in newsrooms that are really, like, the reporters are exhausted. This has been a really challenging year. It is really important when you set goals for the newsroom that you make sure that this is something that there is a real chance of succeeding, or you can at least make meaningful progress. Time bound, there's a clear deadline, and this is important for measuring the success. You need to understand what is the point at which we are going to step back and evaluate whether we hit our goal. And then particularly if you're an organization with equity sort of at the center of your work, like Chalkbeat, you're going to want to make sure that elements of inclusivity and equity are present in those goals. And somebody asked a question earlier today about how do you balance offering membership benefits with a commitment to equity. In this case, you might not limit your membership benefits to those paying members because of that sort of commitment to equity. And so you're not setting goals around getting members to engage. You're setting goals around audience members engaging, if that makes sense. So the MPP process that we've worked with a few organizations going through, and it actually bore a lot of resemblance to the process that Allison went through herself at Chalkbeat, begins with your value proposition. I appreciate that some people have been posting them in the chat, and also that they're workshopping them. Also remind you that there are office hours if you ever want to spend a little bit more time working on this. But identifying your value proposition is a really helpful first step, because it gets to that point of making sure that any goals that you make fit within the strategy for the strategic vision for your organization. And then the next step, you all are probably familiar with this template at this point, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that one. The next step is to, next slide. Similar to last week, I first wanted to show what it might look like if Chalkbeat had used the strategizer template to articulate their value proposition. You can see it pretty clearly here on the screen. Allison, do you want to say anything more about this? Sort of how you landed on this as the value prop? It's okay if it's just straightforward and you feel good about it.
No, I think an important thing here is like, fundamentally, I think people want to, like, if they're reading you, they like want to support you, right? So in many ways, the framing here isn't like convince people of a thing that they never would have done otherwise. Like, a lot of it is just like people have good intentions but live busy lives and forget, and or like don't know how to use a website, or like the credit card is in another room. And like, so for me, it's like more about like, how do you just unlock that last step? Like, for instance, we never expect a first-time reader to donate. Like, this is after all of our donors are going to be like long-ish term like readers of Chalkbeat, and this is really just like closing the deal in many ways, right? So this is why I frame this as like removing the barriers and making it easy. It's more about like smoothing it out so that you can like, it's almost like low-hanging fruit here, right? And like the people who are already kind of committed to what you're doing. I think that's, to me, the most important thing. It's like, you're not selling them something they don't already want to support, at least like, you know, like cosmically. I mean, explain the language here.
Great. And so, yeah, as you can see here, this value prop is focused on the sort of revenue side of their membership program, reflecting the fact that Chalkbeat made the decision that they would keep their engagement work open to their entire audience, not their membership. And so this is their membership value proposition that you'll see here. Next slide. So the next step to that is articulating an outcome, sort of layering that on top of your value proposition. You are going to, many of you are writing value propositions or using the strategizer template quite specifically. And so there's two sort of how it works answers at the end. If you do it that way, You might be splitting it into 2 statements like the one you see on the screen, but pretty straightforward. It follows the value proposition statement, and then it layers the outcome after that. Our membership program helps our loyal supporters who want to do X buy X in order to Y. And on the next screen, you'll be able to see what it looks like if Chalkbeat had layered that on top of the value proposition that we already shared. Our membership program helps our loyal readers who want to further education equity by enabling them to support our journalism on an ongoing basis in order to diversify our revenue model in a more consistent way. The diversification of revenue model in a more consistent way is the outcome that you see there. It's pretty straightforward. I know it seems very like step by step, but this will be helpful, especially if you're getting to squishier areas like trying to understand how you might look at articulating outcomes for engagement elements of membership. And the next step, as you saw with Allison's presentation, is breaking that down into testable questions. You might have 1 question, you might have 4 questions. It's, however many ways you want to slice the evaluation of whether you are reaching that outcome. In this case, Allison, you want to share the sort of 3 questions that you broke that outcome down into?
Yeah, I think we went over this quite a bit previously, but it's just like conversion rate and like how much money we're making, the churn rate, which is more of like a year-long time frame, and then does this pay for itself? No matter how much money you make, if you're putting more into it than getting out of it, you probably shouldn't do it.
Right. Thanks. And so this is just an example. When we say testable questions, you need to be able to figure out a way that you would come to an answer to that question. It might not be a yes, no. It might be like a how far did we get? But you want to make sure that these are questions that you could conceivably find an answer to in like a reasonable time frame. And then the next step is choosing the indicators or metrics that you're going to be looking at to evaluate whether you accomplish that. At MPP, we use metrics when it's going to be something quantitative, and we call them indicators when it's going to be something qualitative. I'm just explaining the language that we use. There are a lot of different ways that people talk about the same thing, but when you're going back to the membership guide and going through this process, that's just something to know about. And as you see here now, we've put it all together. The question is, do membership appeals convert at a higher rate than our previous appeals? The indicator that you're going to need for that is the conversion rates from before, when they were focused on a one-time donations model, and the conversion rates from when they transitioned to inviting people to become members. And Allison shared here very helpfully the sort of math that they would have to do to figure that out for donors. It's much more straightforward figuring out for membership because they were about to start asking people to join the membership program. But she shares here how they figured out the measurement for donations, for the conversion rate for those donors versus when they launched the membership program. Next slide. The last step is putting it all together into an objective. This is the final step of the goal setting process. And a few straightforward things. And for those of you who have maybe participated in table stakes or a program like that, this might sound quite familiar. But a good objective is going to be clear and actionable. It's going to have a time frame, specified metrics or markers. And as Allison showed in her case study, it will answer the question of what does success look like very clearly. This is one of the most valuable ways to sort of gather data about whether your membership program is doing what you wanted it to do for you. That is at the core of this, understanding whether it is worth the time and resources and other forms of like organizational investment that you're making into membership. If you can set measurable, clear goals, you will be able to evaluate if it is worth the amount of resources that you're putting into the program. It might tell you also, as Allison indicated, questions about where in the organization the people that work on membership might sit. It might tell you what benefits you're incorporating into your membership program. The overarching goal of this is to help you evaluate if what you're doing is working. Let's show what that looks like on the next slide. Chalkbeat's objective. In the next year, our newsletter subscriber to supporter conversion rate will increase from 2% to 2.5%, getting closer to top of the industry benchmarks. This is a very simple statement. It seems like a lot of work maybe to get up to it, but what is really great about this, it is so obvious when Chalkbeat will reach a success benchmark on this. It is tied very directly to that goal for their membership program of increasing small dollar support. And there's a very clear time frame at which point they're going to step back and assess whether this is working. I appreciate that transparency, Allison. Is there anything else to sort of observe on that objective setting process? Like, could you share a little bit maybe how you decide what to set your numerical goal at? Where do you look for indicators of where you should set like achievable but realistic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's like at the end of the day, the way this is going to get a little abstract, but like every step of the way, like you can increase, like from a membership or a revenue point of view, like you think about everything like a funnel, right? There's I have a lot of funnels in my life. So it's like top of the funnel is how many people are reading Chalkbeat at all, who like even know about us, right? Or like, yeah, how many even know that we exist? 1. 2 is like how many people come to our site? How many of those people subscribe to our newsletter? How many of the newsletter people actually open the newsletter? How many of those people end up donating? And like that, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then other people who donate, how much do they donate? So like any one of those metrics is like, could be the metric you care about. And so what you got to look at is like some cross section of like, what is measurable? So like an example of not measurable is like, how many people know about Chalkbeat? Like, I have no fucking idea, right? Like a lot, but like not that many, like not as much as the New York Times probably. And it's kind of unknowable and unmeasurable in like, you know, like at least by us and within a reasonable budget. 1, so like, is it knowable? 2, is it movable? Like, can you actually affect it directly? Is it, there's another one that I'm totally thinking, oh, is there room to grow, right? So like, if you're at the top of the industry already, like it's not a great metric because are you really gonna move it? But like, if you're where we are at, which is like average to slightly below average, like we should be able to, like, why can't we get to 2.5? I actually just don't know yet, but like it should be directionally someplace we can get to. And then also like, is it a place in the quote unquote funnel that you have a lot of control over, right? So we have a lot of control over our news, our ability to send emails and how frequently and how good they are and where the button is. So this should be a place where we spend time. And another place we should be spending more time is how many people actually subscribe to our newsletters. We should be able to drive that more if we invest in it, right? So I think like taking those things in mind and finding where you have room to grow and where you have control is the way to think about that.
Great, thank you. And next slide. So just to recap sort of the process that we've gone through, and we're ahead of schedule, so we'll have a good amount of time at the end of class today to take questions. You are going to return to your value proposition statement. I love seeing Chris and V workshop this in the chat, and Chris is giving great advice about getting a little bit more specific. So everyone pay attention to Chris's advice on value proposition work. The next is that you're going to break that statement into 2, potentially, if you've used both of those fields in the statement, both of those and by fields, you're going to break it into 2 statements, and you're going to add an outcome to each of those statements. And then you're going to identify testable questions that will identify whether you are achieving that outcome. You're going to identify the metrics and indicators that will measure whether you are achieving that outcome. And then you're going to identify the objectives, or essentially that's when you get to that final step of goal. Where are you trying to get to in this process? So I know that this is a little bit less rousing than the session last week on telling your story, but this is just as essential a component as what Jay walked us through last week in terms of how to tell your story in convincing ways, because if you don't take a beat before you launch your membership program or before you launch a big effort to refine your membership program, if you already have one, if you don't take a beat to assess what it looks like for it to work for you, you're going to end up just sort of like throwing a bunch of things at the wall to see what sticks. And going through this process can help you use your resources much more effectively, evaluate what's working, and understand before you begin to face retention challenges or growth challenges, what are the little things that you can be changing along the way that can make it an easier process for people. I'm glad to hear that, V. Thank you for that. Any new questions in the chat? How do you find benchmarks that are reliable for what you are doing? That is going to depend on what outcome you're trying to achieve. If you're maybe trying to, I'm just going to throw something out there. If you are trying to increase the percentage of your members that you would consider loyal, you might decide that your newsletter open rates is where you're going to seek that information. And so the metric you're going to be paying attention to is your newsletter open rate. If you're trying to figure out how to compare yourself to others, it depends on sort of what type of news organization you are. The public radio space is fantastic for having benchmarks around membership, but you might, if you're like a small local digital startup, you might struggle, you might not find those to be the best comparisons for you. In the membership guide metrics section, we've linked to some of the best places for benchmarks. News Revenue Hub is a great resource if you are a digital member-driven outlet. They have great, from working with so many clients, they have pretty solid benchmarks. You will also find the Reuters. If you're an organization outside the United States, you might look to Reuters Institute for Journalism's digital news report. It's an annual report on the state of journalism around the world. So it really depends on what you're trying to find out. Another place that's great to look, especially if you're an organization like Chalkbeat, that is connected very deeply to like a societal good, the M&R Benchmarks report, which largely looks at the nonprofit space. That can be really useful for understanding. That might look at like donation benchmarks for libraries and educational causes and other sort of like do-gooder causes. But especially if you're an organization like Chalkbeat, you're covering health or gun violence or other issues that are sort of seen as cause-driven, benchmarks from the nonprofit space might be really helpful for you. Any other places where you go, Allison, to set benchmarks, or is it largely an internal process?
Yeah, there are two things, right? Internal, what you did last year, but that only gets you so far because you're always going to undershoot if you're only trying to incrementally improve from your year before. But those are good places to start. And then, yeah, I would say so like I think one, there's the funnel I said is like kind of universal, right? Like there's not. Maybe I can put something together, but it's like it's like top, you know, like do people know about you? Do people read you? Do people sign up for your things? And then they donate, and then there's like conversion rates throughout. So like those are like in some ways standard. And then if you want to figure out where other people stand, yes. So News Revenue Hub has, I think industry benchmarks are good. You really need detailed ones like from specific organizations though, because I think the size and type of organization really does matter. I think place-based ones actually do better than topic-based ones like us. Maybe that's what I'm telling myself. That's the reason why ours is so low. But like, like who knows? But I think those are good. But like, there is a there's nothing else like Chalkbeat, honestly. So it's like hard to tell. So I just think like, yeah. So those benchmarks and some of the key ones do exist. News Revenue Hub is where we got a lot, and some of it is just talking to people. I have notes from like there's stuff out in the world, like people have posted their own stuff on Medium. So like Reveal had a couple things out in the world. And so there's some like very cursory research you could do that's out there. But does the News Revenue Hub make their stuff public? We're part of them, so I know we get access, but they publish it out. Yeah. So those are
they do a really great sort of aggregate. I don't think they share individual newsrooms stats unless that newsroom agrees to it, but they do a great sort of aggregate. And the MPP case studies, that's one of the reasons why we asked every organization that we did a case study on to share their numbers, so you could understand if understand if they were relatable to you in size and reach, for example.
Yeah, and that's just the easiest way to do it. Like, I wouldn't. You don't want to spend more time than that, really. It's more, in some ways, it's more important just to pick the metric and then actually measure it internally to see if you can grow it. And then it's just nice to know where other people stand. Like I've seen, apparently there's like some newsletter to donor conversion rates as high as like 8%. I feel like that must be a lie. It's so high. I can't even get ours to jump like a percentage point. So I don't know. It's frustrating. It's really frustrating, but we'll continue to work on this.
The metrics will be a continual challenge. The benchmarks are also a continual challenge. We're working here at MPP to try and gain more of a picture of where the membership space is. Any more questions for either generally for the session or for Allison specifically with Chalkbeat? Did we get through? If anybody asked a question early on that I didn't get to, just drop it in the Ask a Question button, and we can get to it maybe after I go through what's sort of coming up next. So as always, we have office hours next Tuesday. The sign up form, actually, Yossi is going to share a link to those office hours here in the chat, and it will also go out in the Monday morning via email. If you want to do things like workshop your value proposition much more specifically or chat through ideas you have for participation opportunities, that's where to go for that. And then here are 2 optional assignments. As always, identify one objective for your membership program using the framework that we provided. And then you could also identify one participation opportunity that you could offer your audience members. And I love Greg laid out George laid out their entire process. It's a phenomenal example of how audience members can contribute really essential information that allows you to do journalism that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. I think an important thing to take away from the memberful routines conversation is that engaged journalism isn't like a nice to have thing that you do to like sound nice in donor letters. It is actually something that it can improve the quality of the journalism that you are doing. And George's example is a great articulation of something that they couldn't have done if they hadn't been able to enlist their audience members to gather the information. It's also a great point that police officers might be, or local authorities might feel very comfortable ignoring the local journalists, but they're a lot less comfortable potentially ignoring constituents. And so by having that request come from community members, you maybe increase the impact of the answers. An organization in Dublin, when they launched their voter guide, and there were many candidates who had not answered their questionnaire, they included a button on the page for that candidate that said, so-and-so did not answer our request for feedback. Why, if you are their constituent, use this button to email them to ask that they answer our questionnaire. So all of a sudden, these candidates were getting bombarded with requests to fill out the questionnaire from people that they hoped to get vote for them. And it was much more effective at getting these like candidates who had been ignoring the request from the local news organization to go and fill out the questionnaire. So that's another moment where a request coming from a community member might be more impactful than a request that's coming from a journalist. Next week, we will be talking about how to design your membership program. We will share a sort of sacrificial step-by-step process that MPP likes to use for designing your membership program, with a little bit of like rapid brainstorming amongst the group. And then Sarah Glenn, who is the director of loyalty programs at Texas Tribune and therefore manages their membership program, will be sharing some of the key decisions that the Texas Tribune has made along the way to decide what benefits to offer and how they've been able to sort of leverage benefits that are showing traction to increase the chances of converting loyal readers into members.
And just to note, that's in 2 weeks, December 4th. We're off next week for the Thanksgiving holiday in the US. Thank you.
And Brent, you're right. ProPublica has done a lot of really great engagement journalism. If you read the memberful routine section, you'll actually find they graciously shared with us a number of like the templates that they will use for sort of doing these engaged journalism projects. So you'll find some templates in the memberful routine section that you can riff on. Yes, next session is December 4th. There is not a session on Thanksgiving weekend. Sorry if I misspoke. I apologize.
That's fine. But we do have office hours next week. Correct. Right.
And yes. The link to sign up for office hours is in the chat. So definitely encourage you all to take advantage of that opportunity. It's time to ask questions or ask feedback or engage in a very intimate Zoom conversation. So please sign up.
That's a good point. It's small and it's Zoom based, so it's video. So you can, it's not you have to type your questions in. You can have a little dialogue about it.
Yeah. Got a lot of people in this course, so it's a little bit hard for us to meet those individual needs as much in this, but the office hours are there for that. And also, we will occasionally answer questions that come up in this chat that we can't get to in the class in the discussions part of the membership guide. I think we covered all of the questions that came up today, so likely we're not doing that this week, but I did answer a number of the audience research questions that came up over on that discussions link that, again, will be included in the Monday wrap-up that Yossi shared. So all the places that you can get the information. Great.
And this link stays live, by the way. You can come back and watch this or share it with your colleagues. So many ways to access it. I think we're out of time.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Allison, for joining us. I hope it was
Allison.
helpful to see how a news organization went through this process. Please make sure to spend some time setting goals for your membership program before you start. I think you'll find it to make it a lot less overwhelming down the line. So thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.